with is coca.
Alright, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Conscientious Emergence. Alright, a little while ago I lined in and drew out this little clownfish. So I've got some bright orange mixed up, some white, and some black, and we're just going to color in the clownfish.
First thing they want to tell you is that it's not a drug, it's a food.
Had the world's craziest sneeze.
Tim Plowman, God rest his
there
soul, a good friend of many of us, who died a few years ago, a great field botanist. He did studies of the nutritional value of coca and discovered that, in fact, in a coca-using population, up to 30% of the vitamins and minerals in the diet are coming from coca. And it is not a social problem. It does not lead to antisocial behavior or child abandonment or violence or anything like that. It is, in fact, largely, it makes life possible in the jungle because it gives you the energy that you must have. The jungle is an extremely encroaching place. And if the only tool you have to hold back the jungle is a self-sharpened machete, in the absence of coca, you would toss in the towel after a couple of weeks of struggling with this. In the presence of coca, you can settle down to a lifetime. It's a short life. You'll be dead between 35 and 40. But a lifetime of struggling with the jungle. You see, one misconception that it's probably important to clear up that people have about the jungle is when they see the climaxed tropical rainforest, they assume that this tremendous richness of vegetation must signal a tremendous availability of food, fruits and things. This is not at all the case. It's very easy to starve to death in a tropical jungle. And the reason for this, especially an old tropical jungle like the Amazon, the reason for this is because evolutionary competition is so keen among species that there is no luxury to produce rich, juicy fruits loaded with sugars and stuff like that. I mean, often in the Amazon, people will show you what they're eating as a treat, something they found along the trail. And when you bear down on what it is, it's often a fruit or something like that that has just a millimeter thin film of slightly sweet pulp or something like that around it. There isn't it's not a place where it's easy to get a food supply together. So a drug like coca, which suppresses appetite, this is its second important consequence, is in great demand. And the suppression of appetite, the providing of energy, it's made for this very, very harsh environment. The other thing is there are other psychoactive compounds in coca, other so-called canes, and they mitigate the property of the cocaine. Western science got a hold of this and quickly turned it into cocaine, which is, very hard on the major muscles of the heart, highly addictive, and, a fairly pernicious drug, although it's the monkey doing it that you usually have to wonder about. And then, in our perverse way, we go to crack cocaine, which is an even more virulent form, more easily delivered. And the evolution of drug delivery systems is an interesting aspect of the whole drug problem. Hypodermic syringes were invented in the 19th century, just in time for the invention of morphine. And following on the heels of those two inventions were two great wars, the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War in Europe, happening at roughly the same time. Out of those two wars emerged the first population of hard drug addicts in Western culture. There had never been anything like that before. At the close of the Civil War, morphine addiction was called the soldier's disease because there had been so much indiscriminate use of morphine on the battlefields of the Civil War. I am answering your question about agriculture, but stick with me here. So then this is, to my mind, the partnership paradise of prehistory in which the feminine was honored, men and women existed in equilibrium, child-caring was shared, men, because of the strong upper body and different physical characteristics, were assigned the hunting, and also because women had babies clinging to them all the time and were not so mobile. So there was an early division of labor. And I think, although I wouldn't argue this to the death, but it seems reasonable to me, that women are probably the inventors of language. And for this we can both thank them and wonder about the consequences of it. Now, why would women be the inventors of language? It's because hunting is a fairly generalized concept where great emphasis is placed on stoic waiting and physical strength. You need to be able to keep your mouth shut for hours and hours at a time, sitting stock still, waiting, and then when the moment comes, just wail on whatever it is that's running by. The position of the gatherer is an entirely different problem, and the women took the gathering. What gathering is all about is fine distinctions. You want to be able to say, when someone says to you, where did you find these wonderful roots? You want to be able to say, they're down near the sulfur spring. They grow in the ground underneath the plant with the small yellow flowers and the serrated leaf edge with furry underneath. In other words, it's a tremendous problem of location linguistically. And if any of you are botanists, you know that until the invention of photography, botany created a whole special language for itself called taxonomic description, where you would say, well, this plant is cespitose with crenellate leaves and trichomes are present, and what this is an excruciatingly detailed physical description. And women also were socialized more than men because they shared child care, they spent time together in food preparation, and food preparation is part of it as well. You have to be able to not only tell where the plant came from, you have to create a linguistic machine for conveying how it is to be used. Well, I think that this partnership paradise was really the moment when human beings were most human, most at peace within and without, between men and women, between adults and children, between the human family and the environment, because we were nomadic, our populations were kept small, and I think that the sexual style of these early human beings, that we can reconstruct it by looking at phenomenon like the pygmy chimpanzees, and then looking at sexual and social styles among Aboriginal people, like in the Amazon. And the chief thing that comes out of that is group values predominate. So consequently, the great tension that drives our society, which is the tension of mate claiming and holding, which we call, maintaining and breaking relationships, really wasn't there. If you in that hunter-gatherer, quasi-nomadic situation, the natural style would have been orgiastic. And orgy has a very interesting social consequence. It makes it impossible for men to trace lines of male paternity. This is very important. In other words, the children in an orgiastic society are society's children. Women know who their children are because they see them come out of their bodies, and unless they put them down and forget where they put them, they will always be able to go back to their children. Because the sex act and the fact of birth are separated by 9 months, it took a long, long time for the role of the specific male to dawn on these societies. Once male paternity becomes an issue, there's tremendous tension because the orgiastic style is appealing on one level to everybody, I think. But on another level, if you're concerned about male paternity, you want to suppress orgy, you want to control women, and in fact you begin to think of them as my women and your women, and I have nothing to do with your women and you have nothing to do with my women. So women become a source of great anxiety in this situation. Well, now this is, I want to make it clear, this is not to say that we fell from grace, from a state of grace that was laid on to us by nature, because the style of all monkeys is male dominance. Even if you go back to the primitive primates, the squirrel monkeys and like that, male dominance hierarchies are always what's happening. So I think that the admission of psilocybin into the proto-hominid diet actually corrected, if you want to use that word, corrected a social style that had been present in the monkeys for millions of years, and just for maybe 50 or 100,000 years, the tendency to form male dominance hierarchies was suppressed by this cult of psilocybin use on the plains of Africa. Well then, the very forces which created this situation, which were the drying up of the African continent, which shrank the great rainforests, broke up this partnership paradise, because the mushrooms became, instead of being abundant all year long on these rainy grasslands, the rains became less frequent. The distance between water holes became greater. The mushrooms became seasonal. The orgies, which had probably been lunar at first, become more stretched out. Maybe they're equinoctial and solstitial, and finally annual, and finally occasional, and finally they don't happen at all. Now, while this is going on, people are aware that the mushroom is getting harder to access. And so, for the first time, they begin thinking of strategies of preservation. And in a world without refrigeration, the obvious strategy is drying or preserving in some medium. Drying of mushrooms is not an effective strategy unless you have hermetically sealed peanut butter jars and Ziploc baggies and stuff which we presume they didn't have. So then your only choice is some method of preservation. And what I see in the archaeology of the ancient Near East is a supplanting of the mushroom cult by a cult of honey. And honey is a very excellent antiseptic preserving medium. And in many cultures it's used that way. In Mexico to this day, in the Mexican Indian villages, they put the mushrooms and stir them into honey, and then they can preserve them for many months that way. There's a problem here, though, which is that honey itself can become an intoxicating substance. Honey ferments into mead, which is a crude form of alcohol. Well, alcohol could hardly be more different than psilocybin in terms of the social values that it promotes. Alcohol promotes an inflated sense of ego, an inflated sense of one's linguistic skill, and a lowering of sensitivity to social cueing. You see this in any singles bar, you know. The guys become boorish, they hit on the women because now finally they have the courage to hit on the women, and the whole thing gives rise to the fairly unhappy cultural situation of which we are the heirs. I mean, most women, I don't know how true it is of the women in this room under 30, but most women, their early sexual imprinting goes on in an ambiance of alcohol use and abuse. And that's then lifelong because, it steals one's nerves for love and battle. This is what was, or love or battle. This is what was always said about alcohol. So the women who were the gatherers of this hunting and gathering equation, essentially they were too smart. They outsmarted themselves. They had this enormous database on wild plants and plants that could be gathered in the environment. And they were nomads. And what nomadism means in this African context is that you follow the great herds of cattle around on a yearly cycle as they move from waterhole to waterhole. And you camp for a few weeks, and then you move on, following the herds. The problem with this is, in the discard of these camps, in the middens of these camps, there would inevitably be seeds discarded as waste. Well, at a certain point, women noticed that the middens, the dumps of last year's camp, was a great place to find food because it seemed to concentrate in those places. And it was because the seeds were being discarded there. So at some point, a Lady Einstein of the High Paleolithic put it together. And it's interesting, this has to do with the conquest of the temporal dimension in terms of cause and effect. In other words, at the same time that the guys were figuring out, oh, if you have sex with this woman, then 9 months later there will be a child, the women were figuring out, oh, if we throw food away here and bury it, 12 months later there will be food growing on this very spot. Well, at that point, this huge database of information on plants that could be gathered was dumped. And the women said, we don't have to do that anymore. Let's just take what we know about emmer wheat, rye, oats, and a couple of other cereal grains, and we will grow those, and we don't have to gather anymore. Or gathering can decline in importance tremendously. But in order to care for the emmer wheat and the rye and the oats, the sedentary lifestyle displaced the nomadic lifestyle. And I talked a little bit last night about the consequences of the invention of agriculture. The first consequence was surplus, something the human race had never dealt with before, because in the hunter-gatherer situation, once you've gathered enough, you stop working. Agriculture is a process where you sort of push a button, and lo and behold, here comes abundance. More abundance than you know what to do with. So you have a new problem. The problem is not getting enough food. Now the problem is preserving it and defending it. And both of these problems can be solved by ceasing to wander and beginning to build walls. And so this is what was done. The most advanced structure human structure on this planet 10,000 years ago was the grain tower at Jericho. And it was specifically built for agricultural surplus, and it was built with walls around it to defend itself. Around 10 to 11,000 years ago, in the archaeological record, all across Europe, the ancient Middle East, and North Africa, we get the appearance of what's called the Tanged Point Technocomplex. What this means is, in older strata than the strata of the Tanged Point Technocomplex, when you find an arrowhead, you find one arrowhead. It was lost by some Paleolithic hunter in the pursuit of game. 12,000 years ago, what you suddenly find are huge concentrations of arrowheads in one place. This means these are not hunting sites. These are sites where somebody laid siege to somebody else's scene in order to grab their women and their food supply and their animals. In other words, warfare is the natural consequence of agriculture. And the cultural pattern that we see in the ancient Middle East is a pattern of walled cities, kingship, suppression of women, slavery, and bronze-tipped warfare. All the progenitors of our own curiously twisted cultural adaptation are set in place there.
This is a slide which may be only important to me.
All right, so there he
what you're
is.
saying is that
Happy little clownfish.
really once the first woman or group of women, whoever it was,
And he'll need some detail and some fine-tuning. I've also done a little detailing to the jellyfish. I guess I'll pan over to that. So you can see he's a little smoother and more detailed now. Not a tremendous amount, but some. He still needs some work. But that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting conscientious emergence. Thank you for watching and have a good night, Earth.